I never told my new husband about the storage units. Not one word, not even a hint. When people find out, they usually stare at me for a second, like they're trying to figure out if I'm serious. Then they ask why. And I tell them the same thing every time, because I've lived long enough to know that what a person does with information they didn't earn tells you everything you need to know about them. I was 63 when I remarried. His name was Boyd. Boyd Mercer. He had gray eyes and a laugh that filled a room, and he brought me sunflowers the first time he came to my house for dinner, which, I'll be honest, made me feel as I hadn't felt in a very long time. My first husband, God rest him, never once thought to bring flowers. That was just how things were back then. You didn't think about it. I'd been a widow for 4 years by the time I met Boyd. 4 years of figuring out who I was without someone else beside me. 4 years of eating breakfast at 6 in the morning with no one to talk to, then slowly realizing that maybe that was all right. More than all right sometimes. I want to be clear about something before I go further because I think it matters. I wasn't lonely in the way people assume when they hear widow 63 remarried. I wasn't desperate. I had my routine. I had my Tuesday morning walks with a friend from church. I had my Thursday dinners with my daughter and her kids. I had a life that felt full and mine in a way it hadn't been in decades, because for most of my adult life, I'd organized everything around my husband and my children and my home, and somewhere in those 4 years alone, I'd quietly built something for myself. The storage units were part of that. It started almost by accident. My first husband and I had owned a small piece of commercial property on the edge of town, nothing glamorous, a strip of land he'd bought on a handshake deal from a man he knew through the Elks Lodge. When he passed, the property came to me. I had no idea what to do with it. My daughter kept saying I should just sell it. It's just sitting there, Mom. Take the money and be done with it. But I didn't sell it. I don't know exactly why. Stubbornness, maybe. Or some instinct I hadn't learned to name yet. I talked to a man named, well, it doesn't matter what his name was, a contractor. Someone who had built facilities like this before. He walked the land with me twice, then sat across from me in a diner and drew a rough diagram on the back of a paper placemat. Climate-controlled units, different sizes. The storage business, he said, was steadier than people thought. People always need somewhere to put things they can't throw away. That sat with me. I was 60 years old. I had a modest inheritance from my husband's life insurance, a fully paid-off house, and a piece of land. I had 3.5 decades of running a household on a single teacher's salary, which is to say I knew how to manage money in ways that most people wouldn't believe. I built the facility. 18 months of stress and permits and more phone calls than I care to remember. By the time it opened, I had 36 units. Within a year, I expanded to 54. I hired a property manager, a capable young woman who handled day-to-day operations so I didn't have to be there every morning, and slowly, steadily, the income started coming in. It wasn't a fortune, but it was mine. Completely and entirely mine. My name on the deed, my name on the accounts. No one else's. That was the thing I couldn't explain to people without sounding paranoid. I liked having something no one knew about. Not because I was hiding it, but because I'd spent so many years having nothing that was only mine that the feeling of it, the quiet, private satisfaction of it, was something I was reluctant to share. I met Boyd at a friend's birthday dinner. He was her brother-in-law's college roommate, which is such a convoluted connection that I almost didn't go that night. I had a slight headache and the weather had turned cold, and I was tired in the way that 63-year-olds get tired, not sleepy exactly, just done. But I went. He was already seated when I arrived. He stood up when I walked in. I don't know if that sounds small, but it wasn't. Men of our generation were raised to stand when a woman walked into a room, and most of them had long since stopped doing it. Boyd stood. We talked for most of the dinner. He'd been retired for 2 years after a career in municipal water management, which is honestly not a subject that sounds interesting until you hear someone who loves it talk about it, and Boyd loved it. He told me about aquifers and filtration systems with the same energy my grandchildren use when they talk about things they've discovered. I found it charming. I still do, even now, even knowing everything I came to know later. He asked if he could call me. I said yes. For the first several months, things were straightforward and genuinely sweet. He was attentive without being smothering. He was curious about my life in a way that felt real, not performed. He asked about my daughter, about my grandchildren, about what I'd done before I retired from teaching. He remembered details from week to week in a way that told me he was actually listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak. I told him about the property, the land my husband had left me, in vague terms. I mentioned that I had some rental income. I didn't say from what exactly, or how many units, or what the monthly numbers looked like. He didn't press. I noted that he didn't press. When he proposed, we were sitting on the back porch of his house, watching the sun go down behind the tree line. It was October, the air with that particular chill that smells like wood smoke and dead leaves. He pulled out a small box and set it on the armrest between us, and he said, "I'm not going to make a whole speech because you're a practical woman and I think you'd rather I didn't." And then he asked me. I said yes. But I also called an attorney the following week. I want to tell you something about that because I think some people will read this part and think I was cold, calculating, that I didn't trust him. That's not quite right. I trusted Boyd. I did, but I also knew that trust and precaution are not opposites. My mother taught me that, actually, not in those words, but in the way she kept the household accounts in her own name after a neighbor lost everything in a divorce. "You love people with your whole heart," she used to say, "and you keep your paperwork neat." My attorney helped me set up a legal structure that kept my business interests clearly separate from any marital assets. It wasn't complicated, but it was deliberate, and it was done before the wedding, not after. We married in the spring. Small ceremony. My daughter and my son-in-law, Boyd's son from his first marriage, a handful of close friends. We had a nice dinner at a restaurant that one of Boyd's friends recommended, and by 9 o'clock I was home in what was now our shared house with my new husband, exhausted and happy. Boyd's son, I'll call him my stepson, though the word felt a little odd at 63, came with his wife. They were pleasant enough that evening. He had his father's gray eyes and considerably less of his father's warmth. His wife was quiet in a way I couldn't read, the kind of quiet that might be shyness or might be calculation, and at the time I didn't know which. I found out. It started, this is always how it starts, subtly. Small things that you file away and tell yourself don't mean anything. The first time was about 4 months after the wedding. My stepson and his wife came for dinner, and his wife, spent a good portion of the evening asking about the property, not bluntly. She was too smart for blunt. She asked it sideways, the way you do when you're trying to get information without seeming like you're trying to get information. How big is the parcel? Are you thinking of selling eventually? Who manages it for you? I answered everything in a way that was technically true and completely uninformative. I've taught middle school. I know how to manage a conversation. Boyd wasn't in the room for most of this exchange. He'd stepped out to take a phone call from an old friend. I noticed that the timing of her questions seemed to track with his absence, but I told myself I was being uncharitable. The second thing was the investment suggestion. My stepson pulled me aside after dinner, Boyd was in the kitchen, and told me about an opportunity he was involved with, something about a development project. Mixed use, he said, ground floor retail, residential above. His voice had the particular cadence of someone who has given this pitch before, and I recognized that cadence because I'd been a landlord for 3 years by then, and I'd met people who talked the way he talked. I told him I'd think about it. I did not think about it, but I paid more attention after that. Over the next few months, I watched the way my stepson and his wife interacted with Boyd when I wasn't the focus of the conversation. Boyd was generous, in the particular way that retired men with a little savings sometimes are, not extravagant, but easily moved. His son knew how to move him. The right question at the right moment, the particular look that said, "I really need you on this, Dad." Boyd had a soft spot for that look. I could see it work on him like a key in a lock. There was a loan. I found out obliquely. Boyd mentioned it over coffee one morning, the way you mention something you assume the other person already knows is about, and I understood from his phrasing that it was not the first such loan. I asked how much. He told me. It was not a small number. Did they pay back the last one? I asked. Boyd got a particular look on his face, the look of a man who doesn't want to answer that question. That was in November. The following February, my stepson's wife asked me directly. We were alone in the living room. Boyd had gone to get his reading glasses. If I had considered adding Boyd to the deed on my property. I looked at her. "It would simplify things," she said, "if anything ever happened to you." I have thought about that sentence many times since, the way she said it, the particular softness of it, how it was dressed up as concern, if anything ever happened to you. As if she were being thoughtful, as if she were helping. "I'll mention it to my attorney," I said. She smiled. I called my attorney the next morning. He had already been thinking along these lines based on some questions I'd asked him in January. He walked me through what would happen under various scenarios, what was protected, what wasn't, what needed to be done to ensure nothing could be touched without my explicit authorization. He used the word insulated. I liked that word. That's what I wanted. Insulation. There were a few changes made, not dramatic ones, but the kind that matter, that hold up. Around the same time, I started noticing things in the house. Not things missing, nothing like that. More like things moved. Papers on my desk rearranged slightly. My filing drawer, which I kept locked but which I had once or twice left unlocked in the morning when I was distracted, looking different than I remembered leaving it. I couldn't prove anything, but I'm not a woman who is easily confused about her own habits. I moved my most important documents to the office where my property manager worked. Everything in one drawer, locked key on a chain I kept on my person. Then came March. My stepson called me on a Thursday evening while Boyd was at his bridge club. He didn't call Boyd's number, he called mine. This was unusual. He had never called my number directly before. He was friendly on the phone, warm even. He asked how I was doing, asked about my grandchildren, made 3 or 4 minutes of small talk with the fluency of someone who has learned that small talk is how you soften a person up. Then he told me he was going through a difficult time financially. The development project had hit obstacles. There were debts. He wasn't asking for himself, he said. This was for his wife, who was under tremendous stress, who hadn't been sleeping. He just needed a short-term bridge, something to hold them over. He'd heard through his father that my business was doing well. He'd heard through his father. I let that sentence sit in the air between us for a moment. How much is a short-term bridge? I asked. He told me. I see, I said. I'll need to look at my situation. Of course, he said. No pressure. There is never any pressure with people like this. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't been through it. The pressure is invisible. It operates through implication and atmosphere, through the looks Boyd gave me when his son's name came up, through the particular way my stepdaughter-in-law said family, as if I should already know what that word was asking of me. I talked to my daughter. She was the only person outside of my attorney who knew the full picture of my finances. She had known from the beginning because I had made a deliberate choice to tell her so that someone in my life could help me see clearly when I couldn't. She was not subtle about her opinion. Mom, she said, you need to have a real conversation with Boyd. She was right. I knew she was right. I had been putting it off because, and I want to be honest about this, I loved Boyd. I genuinely loved him. I did not want to sit across from a man I loved and tell him that I thought his son was trying to maneuver me. I did not want to see Boyd's face when he had to decide who to believe. But I sat down with him on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of gray April afternoon that makes you feel like the world has slowed down, and I told him everything, not accusatorially, not with evidence laid out like a courtroom. Just clearly and quietly and from the beginning. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked. Because I wasn't sure, I said, and because I needed to be sure before I said it out loud. He nodded. He stared out the window at the yard. A cardinal sat on the feeder for a moment and then flew away. The loan, he said. Yes. Another long pause. He's my son, Boyd said. I know he is. I'm not asking you to do anything, I said. I'm asking you to know what I know so that we're standing in the same place. He didn't speak to his son for 2 weeks. I didn't ask him to. He chose it. That told me something important, not about his son, but about Boyd himself, about the man I had married. Eventually they spoke. I wasn't part of that conversation. Boyd came home afterward looking tired and older than usual, and he sat down in his chair and said, he says you misunderstood the situation. I'm sure he does, I said. Boyd looked at me. I told him the finances in this marriage are yours to manage, that I'm not a party to any of it, and that he should not expect anything from you. I looked back at him. Was that the right thing to say? He asked, and for a moment he looked uncertain in the way that people look when they've done something they know is right, but that cost them something real. Yes, I said. That was exactly right. Things changed after that. My stepson and his wife came around less. When they did, the quality of the air in the room was different. Something had been settled, even though nothing had been said directly. My stepdaughter-in-law no longer asked about the property. She was cooler with me, and I was easier with her because of it. Honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is easier to be around than performance. My property manager called me that same spring to tell me we had a waiting list, all 54 units full, 12 people asking to be notified of vacancies. She asked if I'd ever considered expanding. I told her I'd been thinking about it. There's a thing that happens, and I've heard other women my age describe it, where you spend most of your life feeling like your stability depends on other people, and then something shifts and you realize that isn't true. That it was never true. That the stability was always something you built, even when you didn't realize you were building it. I built mine on a piece of land an old man sold to my husband on a handshake. I built it with a paper placemat diagram and 30 years of knowing how to make things work on less than they should. I built it quietly because that was the only way I knew how. And when someone came along and tried to get close enough to take it, not violently, not dramatically, just through the slow, patient work of positioning, it wasn't there to be taken, because I had made it that way before I ever said yes to the sunflowers. My daughter asked me once if I felt guilty about never telling Boyd up front, about keeping the full picture of my finances from him in those early months. I thought about that for a while before I answered. No, I said finally. I told him what he needed to know me. The rest was mine to keep until I knew what he'd do with it. She chewed on that. And when did you know? When he chose to believe me, I said, over his own son. That was the moment. That was when I knew I had married the right man, after all. Boyd is asleep in the other room as I write this. His reading glasses are on the side table where he always leaves them, next to the library book he's been slowly working through for 6 weeks. In the morning, he will make coffee before I wake up, because that's what he does. He will leave a mug on my side of the counter, and the coffee will be exactly right, because he has been paying attention. My stepson sends a card at Christmas now. Nothing more. Wife does not send anything. I don't hold it against either of them. Not anymore. I think they found what they came for in the end. They found out exactly what kind of woman I am. The storage units are 91% occupied this month. We broke ground on the expansion in September. 40 new units, 2 of them large enough for commercial inventory. I still have my property. I still have my name on every document that matters. And I still have the man who brought me sunflowers and stood up when I walked into the room, who chose me over a version of things that would have been easier for him. That is more than I expected when I was a 63-year-old widow sitting at a friend's birthday dinner with a slight headache, thinking about leaving early. I am glad I stayed.